The Screaming Mummy of Egypt refers to a mummified individual discovered in the late 19th century, whose mouth was found wide open, creating a striking expression. This physical condition is documented. The implication is an unusual burial outcome, while the limitation is that facial appearance alone does not explain cause. The mummy was discovered in a cache of royal mummies at Deir el-Bahari, near Thebes, now Luxor. This context implies high-status burial association. The limitation is that secondary reburial complicates original burial interpretation. Unlike most Egyptian mummies, this individual was not wrapped carefully in fine linens. This implies deviation from standard mortuary practice. The limitation is uncertainty about whether this deviation was intentional or circumstantial. The mummy's jaw was not bound shut, which contrasts with typical mummification methods. This suggests a deliberate choice or omission. The limitation is that preservation conditions can affect soft tissues post-burial. Early examinations noted the presence of resin inside the body, but irregular application. This implies partial mummification. The limitation is that early documentation lacked modern forensic standards. The open mouth created speculation about death by pain or suffocation. This implication arises visually. The limitation is that rigor mortis and dehydration can produce similar appearances. Egyptian mummification rituals were designed to preserve the body for the afterlife. Deviation implies social or ritual significance. The limitation is absence of explicit textual explanation. The mummy was wrapped in sheepskin, a material considered ritually impure in ancient Egypt. This implies punishment or exclusion. The limitation is limited comparative evidence for such usage. The sheepskin covering contrasts with linen used for honored dead. This suggests symbolic treatment. The limitation is that practical reuse of materials cannot be ruled out. No inscriptions identifying the individual were found with the mummy. This absence limits identification. The implication is anonymity within a royal cache, while the limitation is missing labels. Radiocarbon dating places the mummy in the New Kingdom period. This situates it historically. The limitation is that dating does not indicate identity or cause of death. The mummy's discovery among royal remains suggests intentional placement. This implies political or protective motives. The limitation is that reburial practices obscure original context. Some researchers propose the mummy may belong to a royal figure punished posthumously. This implies judicial action. The limitation is lack of definitive inscriptions confirming such punishment. Egyptian texts describe executions and dishonorable burials for traitors. This provides cultural context. The limitation is linking texts to this specific case. The absence of the heart, typically preserved, implies ritual deviation. This suggests symbolic erasure. The limitation is uncertainty about whether the heart was removed intentionally. CT scans reveal the mummy was embalmed, but not eviscerated in the usual manner. This implies deliberate alteration of ritual. The limitation is interpreting intention from physical evidence alone. The open mouth may result from dehydration after death, rather than expression at death. This offers a natural explanation. The limitation is incomplete soft tissue preservation. Early museum descriptions sensationalized the mummy's appearance. This influenced public perception. The limitation is separating spectacle from evidence. The mummy's teeth and jaw show no signs of violent trauma. This challenges assumptions of torture. The limitation is that some causes of death leave no skeletal trace. Chemical analysis shows resin was poured into the mouth and throat. This implies ritual action. The limitation is that the purpose of this action is debated. The use of resin may have served preservation rather than punishment. This complicates interpretation. The limitation is lack of parallel examples. The mummy's posture and treatment differ from other royal mummies. This implies special status. The limitation is ambiguity of that status. Egyptian beliefs emphasized proper burial to ensure afterlife. Deviation implies denial or modification of afterlife access. The limitation is interpreting belief from material deviation. The mummy was later unwrapped and rewrapped multiple times. This affects condition. The limitation is modern intervention altering evidence. Some scholars argue the mummy represents a case of political retribution. This implies historical conflict. The limitation is absence of corroborating records. Others interpret the mummy as an example of unusual embalming technique. This suggests experimentation. The limitation is rarity of such methods. Advances in imaging have refined understanding of the mummy's condition. This improves analysis. The limitation is that technology cannot recover lost context. The screaming mummy challenges assumptions about uniformity in Egyptian burial practices. This broadens interpretation. The limitation is limited sample size. Despite extensive study, the mummy's identity and treatment remain uncertain. This sustains debate. The limitation is evidentiary silence. At this contextual stage, the screaming mummy of Egypt is defined by documented physical anomalies, cultural deviation, and unresolved interpretation. The implication is enduring mystery, while the limitation remains clear. Material evidence cannot fully explain intent. Modern forensic analysis has shifted focus from visual appearance to internal evidence. CT scans allow non-invasive examination of bones and tissues. This implies more reliable interpretation, while the limitation is that imaging cannot determine emotional states or exact circumstances of death. Analysis of the jaw position suggests it may have dropped naturally after death. This challenges the assumption of agony at the moment of death. The limitation is that post-mortem changes vary depending on environment and handling. The absence of binding to secure the jaw is unusual but not unique. Some mummies show similar features due to embalming variation. The limitation is that variation alone does not explain why this individual was treated differently. Chemical residue inside the mouth indicates hot resin was poured during embalming. This suggests intentional ritual action. The limitation is uncertainty about whether this act was symbolic, practical, or punitive. The use of resin could have preserved facial features by stabilizing soft tissue. This implies technical reasoning. The limitation is that this method was rarely used, offering little comparative data. The sheepskin wrapping remains one of the most distinctive features. In ancient Egyptian belief, sheepskin was considered ritually impure. This implies dishonor. The limitation is that evidence for consistent symbolic meaning of sheepskin is limited. Some scholars propose the mummy represents a criminal denied full burial rites. This aligns with textual references to punishment. The limitation is that no legal records identify such an individual. DNA analysis has been attempted to identify lineage. This implies potential royal connection. The limitation is that DNA preservation is incomplete and results remain inconclusive. One hypothesis identifies the mummy as a son of Rameses III involved in a palace conspiracy. This implies political execution. The limitation is that genetic evidence does not definitively confirm identity. Egyptian records describe conspiracies punished with death and ritual degradation. This supports contextual plausibility. The limitation is absence of explicit mention of this burial. The mummy's placement among honored royal remains complicates the punishment theory. This implies protection rather than disgrace. The limitation is reconciling placement with treatment. Reburial of mummies during later periods aimed to protect royal bodies from tomb robbers. This implies practical motivation. The limitation is loss of original burial context. Differences between original burial and later rewrapping obscure interpretation. This limits certainty. The implication is layered historical interference. Skeletal analysis shows no evidence of strangulation or broken bones. This narrows causes of death. The limitation is that poison or natural causes may leave no trace. The dramatic appearance has influenced popular narratives more than scientific evidence. This implies perception bias. The limitation is public focus on imagery over data. The mummy's teeth show signs of normal wear, suggesting adult age. This implies maturity. The limitation is broad age estimation. Absence of grave goods typically associated with elite burials suggests atypical status. This implies social deviation. The limitation is incomplete burial inventories. Some Egyptologists caution against over-interpreting anomalies. This implies methodological restraint. The limitation is that restraint leaves questions unanswered. The screaming mummy illustrates how ritual variation can be misread as violence. This challenges assumptions. The limitation is distinguishing intention from outcome. Scientific testing has ruled out several sensational claims. This narrows explanation space. The limitation is that remaining possibilities are still speculative. The case highlights the importance of context in funerary archaeology. Removal from original context reduces interpretive power. The limitation is irreversible displacement. Comparative analysis with other unusual mummies reveals no exact parallels. This implies uniqueness. The limitation is lack of a control sample. The mummy's condition suggests deliberate choices were made during embalming. This implies agency. The limitation is not knowing whose agency or purpose. Advances in forensic Egyptology continue to refine interpretation. This suggests progress. The limitation is diminishing returns without new data. The mummy remains housed in museum collections under controlled conditions. This preserves evidence. The limitation is ethical constraints on further invasive testing. Scholarly debate now centers on ritual meaning rather than cause of death. This reframes inquiry. The limitation is abstract interpretation. The screaming mummy's fame has overshadowed more typical cases. This skews focus. The limitation is disproportionate attention. The combination of impure wrapping and unusual embalming suggests symbolic messaging. This implies social statement. The limitation is decoding symbolism without text. Despite modern techniques, definitive conclusions remain out of reach. This sustains uncertainty. The limitation is evidentiary silence. At this investigative stage, the screaming mummy is better understood physically than culturally. The implication is partial clarity, while the limitation remains unchanged. Intent cannot be confirmed. The screaming mummy's unresolved status highlights how visual anomalies can dominate interpretation in the absence of context. Appearance becomes evidence by default. The limitation is that visual cues are among the least reliable indicators of historical cause or intent. In ancient Egyptian practice, deviation from funerary norms carried meaning, but meanings varied by period and circumstance. This implies flexibility rather than uniform rules. The limitation is assuming consistent symbolism across centuries. The mummy's treatment may reflect a specific legal or ritual category now undocumented. This implies institutional practices beyond surviving texts. The limitation is that undocumented categories cannot be reconstructed with certainty. The contrast between careful preservation and symbolic degradation complicates binary interpretations. This implies mixed intent. The limitation is interpreting contradiction without explanatory records. Museum handling and early unwrapping altered the mummy's condition. This affects interpretation. The limitation is irreversible disturbance of original evidence. The case illustrates how later handling can amplify mystery rather than resolve it. This influences modern narratives. The limitation is separation of ancient actions from modern intervention. Scientific caution has reduced sensational claims, but has not produced closure. This implies methodological maturity. The limitation is acceptance of uncertainty. The screaming mummy demonstrates how punishment, ritual, and preservation can intersect. This suggests complex social signaling. The limitation is decoding signals without textual support. Some scholars argue the anomaly reflects political messaging intended for contemporaries, not future observers. This reframes purpose. The limitation is inability to test audience reception. The mummy's placement among royal remains may indicate protection of lineage despite punishment. This implies nuanced political compromise. The limitation is speculative reconstruction. Comparative cases of denied afterlife rights are rare and poorly documented. This limits contextualization. The limitation is insufficient comparative data. The absence of definitive trauma shifts focus from death to burial. This narrows inquiry. The limitation is incomplete understanding of mortuary variation. Advances in biomolecular analysis may yet refine identity. This suggests future insight. The limitation is degradation of ancient DNA. Ethical constraints limit destructive testing on rare mummies. This preserves heritage. The limitation is restricted evidence access. Public fascination persists because the image contradicts expectations of Egyptian mummification. This sustains interest. The limitation is expectation bias. The case reveals how exceptions illuminate norms. Deviation draws attention to standard practice. The limitation is overemphasis on outliers. The screaming mummy resists definitive categorization as victim, criminal, or ritual subject. This ambiguity defines the mystery. The limitation is categorical overlap. Scholarly consensus favors restrained interpretation grounded in material evidence. This reflects discipline standards. The limitation is unresolved central questions. The mummy's condition underscores how meaning can be lost even when bodies survive. This highlights historical fragility. The limitation is irreversible context loss. The narrative has shifted from sensational death to complex ritual analysis. This improves accuracy. The limitation is reduced narrative clarity. The case continues to inform debates about justice and ritual in ancient Egypt. This broadens significance. The limitation is extrapolation from a single example. Absence of inscriptions remains the primary barrier to identification. This constrains conclusions. The limitation is evidentiary silence. The screaming mummy exemplifies how archaeology confronts uncertainty without resolution. This shapes methodology. The limitation is acceptance of ambiguity. Continued study refines what the mummy is not, rather than what it is. This narrows possibilities. The limitation is negative definition. The balance between preservation and interpretation remains delicate. This affects future research. The limitation is methodological constraint. The mummy's fame ensures ongoing attention, but attention does not equal answers. This sustains inquiry. The limitation is persistent uncertainty. Without new textual or material discoveries, interpretations will remain provisional. This constrains progress. The limitation is dependence on chance. The screaming mummy stands as a case where evidence survives, but explanation does not. This defines its mystery. The limitation is separation of fact from meaning. The unresolved nature of the case reflects the broader limits of reconstructing intent for material remains alone. This informs historical humility. The limitation is epistemological. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you.